This is the Spycraft 101 podcast. Welcome to your clandestine classroom. This is episode number 168 of the Spycraft 101 podcast. Today I'm speaking with Craig Unger. Craig is a journalist and the author of 8 books. He's a graduate of Harvard University, where he worked as an editor for the Harvard Crimson. He's written articles which have appeared in The Washington Post, The Guardian, The New Yorker, The New York Times, Esquire, and other publications. He also served as a contributing editor for Vanity Fair, where he covered national security and foreign affairs for more than 15 years. I invited Craig onto the podcast to discuss his newest book, Den of Spies: Reagan, Carter, and the Secret History of the Treason That Stole the White House, which is available now. It's the story of the October Surprise, a long-rumored secret campaign to delay the release of American hostages in Iran until after Ronald Reagan successfully won the 1980 presidential election. But before we dive into this story, I want to say a big thank you to everyone listening who is also supporting me on Patreon, including Dylan L. and Eric G. Your monthly contributions there help me keep this podcast going week in and week out. As a way of thanking my patrons, I offer a lot of great freebies and promotions, including free and discounted books and products from the Spycraft 101 store. Patrons also get exclusive access to long-form articles of mine that aren't available anywhere else. If you haven't signed up for my Patreon yet, but you want to, just click the link in the show notes on whatever podcast platform you're listening to right now. Craig, thank you for sitting down with me today.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. This story has been mentioned very briefly during a previous episode of the podcast, but I'm really glad for a chance to hear much more about it. And I was also amazed at how, as I read through your book, it tied together so many other events and personalities that we've discussed on here before. Lots of familiar names and places and events.
Right. Well, it's an extraordinary conspiracy, and if you look back at the 1980s and a number of scandals, Iran-Contra, the October Surprise, which I'm writing about, Iraqgate, the BCCI scandal, a lot of them had to do with arms dealing in the Middle East. If you understand the October Surprise, I think you have a much better view of what was really going on then.
Yeah, I totally agree. There's a lot of much needed context here, which I think the listeners will really appreciate, and which I certainly appreciated as well. So, start off with, Craig, can you tell me how long exactly you've been pursuing this particular story?
Right. Well, it's been over 30 years, believe it or not. It
Oh,
actually,
wow.
I started in April 1991. So that's more than 33 years.
My gosh.
And obviously, I've done a lot of other things in the meantime. But on and off, I went to Israel, I went to Iran, I went to France, where I interviewed the former president of Iran. And I kept coming back to it. It was one of these things I just couldn't let go of it.
Hmm. Yeah, I can totally understand that. So, what was significant about April of '91 that brought that story to your attention in the first place?
Well, there was an op-ed piece in the New York Times written by Gary Sick, and Gary Sick is not a household name, but he had been on the National Security Council, the Carter administration, and before that, Gerald Ford's administration. And if you're sort of sophisticated in the world of national security, Gary was and still is a very scholarly figure, a man who's very trustworthy, and that he had written this piece suddenly gave credence to what seemed like very wild allegations. If you remember those years, just after the Islamic Revolution in Iran, people were chanting death to America. They referred to America as the Great Satan. And the Republican Party used to joke about how they would love to bomb Iran to smithereens. So the idea that the Republicans had a secret covert operation going on with Iran to sabotage the presidential election in 1980. That was just off the charts in terms of it. It was so counterintuitive. It was very hard to believe. And yet here you had Gary Sick, a highly reputable figure who made a strong case that it had happened.
Yeah, that really is stunning, no question about it. And I didn't know anything about it at the time in '91. I do remember, now that you just mentioned that about Bomb Iran, I seem to remember a parody song specifically about that, right? Like set to the Beach Boys Barbara Ann, if I remember correctly.
Exactly.
People were
I'm not
singing
going to
"Bomb
sing,
Iran." Yeah,
but
amazing.
bomb Iran. Yeah.
And I do remember several years ago, long before I started this podcast or reading into any of this, I recall hearing or reading that the hostages had been released within like the first hour of the Reagan presidency. And I thought to myself, not knowing anything more about it, wow, they must have been really afraid of Ronald Reagan, the new cowboy in the White House. And they must have assumed they couldn't get away with anything like they could with Carter. And now all of these stories slowly come out years and years and years later and prove there was so much more to the story than what I initially assumed and what probably a lot of people assumed.
Well, they were actually released within minutes of Reagan taking
Minutes.
taking the oath of office.
Wow.
And anyone with any common sense could figure out, well, wait a minute, how could that possibly happen? Reagan couldn't have had no authority to negotiate before he took the oath of office,
Hmm.
and we saw him still on the podium. So what really happened? And the Onion, the satirical magazine, the Onion, put out a book at the end of the 20th century, and they referred to that date and said Ronald Reagan inaugurated, urges America not to put two and two together.
Oh boy, Onion. Yeah, it was one of my favorites for many, many years, no doubt about it. So, did and since you mentioned that, and since the Onion put it out, was that something that was very obvious to many people that there was a lot more going on under the surface right then on inauguration day? I mean, were reporters starting to look into that immediately? You think?
Not as much as you might think. I
Hmm.
mean, it seemed so off the charts that anyone would have made some sort of conspiracy with the militant Islamic fundamentalists. It just didn't make sense initially. But once Gary Six Piece got out there, some people did get on the story. Occasionally, the former president of Iran, Bani Sadr, he had favored a secular democracy. He had been trying to urge the Ayatollah Khomeini to release the hostages. And he had fled from Iran to Paris. And when he was in exile, he began telling a reporter or two that there was this secret deal. And you did see a piece or two in the Miami Herald, one in the New York Times, but by and large, it was not followed up in depth.
I see. I see. And so that was, like you said, April of '91. So that was 11 years later. Yeah, yeah, 11 years. No, 10 years later. Anyway, that it finally started to come out. So, what happened to you personally once you started looking into and writing about this whole story back then?
Well, I did a big story for Esquire magazine, about 10,000 words. And having read Gary Sick's op-ed piece, I said, geez, if he's right, there's got to be facts to back it up. And I found a lot of facts to back it up. And I put together this 10,000 word narrative. It got a lot of attention in Esquire at the time. And immediately afterwards, Newsweek magazine hired me to pursue the investigation. And this was back at a time, I wonder how many of your listeners remember when magazines like Newsweek and Time magazine were powerful forces in the national conversation. This was still the era of print. There was no internet yet. There was no email. There was no bloggers, no social media. And print held sway in terms of shaping the national conversation. So I thought I was in a big position to further the investigation. President Carter got involved and he urged Congress to investigate. So I thought we were off and running on a major, major story. And remember, the Reagan Bush era was still operational. Reagan had served two terms at the time. President George H.W. Bush, Bush Sr., was president at the time, and he was running for reelection. So this was enormously explosive politically. And
Hmm.
I felt being at Newsweek, I was in a position to do a story. This is the kind of story that can make your career. It's like breaking Watergate. And I was really eager to get into it. And what happened next kind of shocked me. And it was as if the entire story went into reverse, and that everything I reported and other people had reported about the October surprise was unreported. And suddenly, we as reporters were attacked, and I was said to be a conspiratorialist, that anyone who would, a lot of our sources were former spies or arms dealers because That's what the story was really about. And the people who know most about arms sales are arms dealers.
Hmm.
But we were sort of ridiculed and derided. And suddenly the nation's press corps did a 180 and said it never happened. I was sued by Bud McFarlane, who was Reagan's national security advisor. And anyone who had been on the story, including me, was kind of, you were derided and your career went into a sharp reverse. So there was enormous pushback at the time, and the story was essentially killed.
Hmm. So that's the first time that I don't know how common it is, honestly, but that's the first time I've heard of a reporter being sued for a published story in terms of the stuff that we talk about here on the podcast. So did Newsweek back you up in any way, or did they kind of cut you adrift at that point once it became so radioactive?
I was sued for the article I wrote in Esquire, and
Ah, okay,
Esquire
okay,
did
yes.
back me up. And we won the suit. I mean, but it went on for years. Part of it, we won initially, but McFarlane appealed to the appellate courts in the District of Columbia. We won at the appellate level, and then he tried to take it to the United States Supreme Court, which denied cert and refused to review it. And I won at every level, but I don't know if people realize how damaging this can be to your career, and it's just bad PR. No one
Hmm.
wants to hire you. You're sort of tainted, and it's hard to evaluate. But essentially, no, your calls don't get returned. You can't get any work, and it took me several years to recover. I ended up moving to Boston, and I finally came back to New York. And I kept going back to the October surprise. I knew it had happened, and I kept and there were a couple of other reporters who I knew felt the same way. We always kept in touch, and over the years I pursued it. I went to Israel on my own dime and got sources there in Israeli military intelligence, and among other things, they told me that they had had secret communications with Bill Casey, who was the campaign manager for Ronald Reagan in 1980. And that's really unusual when you think about it. If whoever is running Kamala Harris's campaign or Trump's, they're not supposed to be having secret meetings with foreign intelligence sources, especially if they're not in the government. And the Reagan team was not in the government at that time.
Hmm. Hmm. Right. Yeah, that seemed very, very unusual, certainly. And I know that Bill Casey is kind of the central figure in your book, certainly. So I want to ask before we get to the part about Casey, I want to talk about what had already happened. So we've definitely talked about the Iranian hostages here on the podcast in the past. So I think the listeners are pretty familiar with how they were, the embassy was taken and everything. But can you talk about Jimmy Carter's response, the Carter administration's response a little bit, besides the Operation Eagle Claw, which we just talked about recently? Like, what kind of diplomatic approach did they take after that, and how effective was it?
Well, there were several ways in which Carter reached out to Iran through back channels. We had terminated official relations with them, and our embassy was
Hmm.
not just closed; it had been taken over. So we didn't
Hmm.
have standard diplomatic relations anymore. But the CIA had an operative named Bob Ames, and he was in touch with operatives who were part of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which was led by Yasser Arafat. And Arafat had good relationships with Iran. He had helped negotiate the release of some of the hostages early on, and he wanted to continue in that vein. But what I found out in the course of doing my book is that Bill Casey's operatives intervened and interrupted those communications. And another way that Carter was trying to reach out to Iran is through two Iranian businessmen. They were brothers, Cyrus Hashemi and his brother Jamshid Hashemi, and they were bankers and arms dealers from Iran. They ended up having homes in the United States, and they went to Jimmy Carter's State Department and said, "Why don't?" Said, "Look, we still have good communications with major figures in the new revolutionary regime. Why don't you let us be intermediaries and try to bring the hostages home?" And Carter went ahead with that, and that was one of the problems. What he didn't realize is that the Hashemis were secretly double agents who were secretly working for the Republican Party, for Bill Casey.
Man, that's incredible. So Bill Casey was a very, very effective guy, clearly at what he had done, but he was not in the government at that time. Can you talk a little bit about his background and what brought him to the Reagan campaign to begin with?
Yeah, I think Casey is a wonderful, colorful figure. I mean, I describe him as being sort of half James Bond, half Mr. Magoo. And he was the kind of guy who slobbered when he talked and spit on people. His table manners were horrible. He spilled food all over his tie and so forth. He seemed to be going in half a dozen different directions at once, but he was dazzlingly brilliant in his way. And in World War II, he had been perhaps the most effective American spy in terms of directing American intelligence against the Nazis, especially after the landing on the beaches of Normandy. And he did a terrific job against the Nazis. But he had not been officially in the intelligence world and wasn't again until 1981 when Reagan made him head of the CIA. That doesn't mean he was not active in intelligence. And what I discovered in doing this book is that he had a secret network that included operatives like the Hashemi brothers. He had ties to corrupt banks who could finance arms deals. He knew arms dealers from South Africa and all over the world who would deal secretly with Iran. There were embargoes against selling weapons to Iran, but Casey knew people who could get around those. He had a very sophisticated network. When I talked to military and intelligence in Israel, the head of Israeli military intelligence, Yahashua Sagi, told me, he said, "Oh, yeah, I was talking to Casey all the time in 1979 and 1980. Well, Casey was not in the United States government then, and he didn't take over the Reagan campaign until March of 1980. So during that time, Casey clearly had key intelligence sources who were keeping him up to date during a very sensitive time. The Iranian Revolution had just taken place in 1979. Iran was one of the great pillars of our policy in the Middle East, and suddenly it had been shaken loose. Everything was unstable, and Casey was on top of what was going on more than anyone knew.
Man, certainly was a perfect guy in the right time and the right place for Reagan at the very least. But it's amazing how effective he was at getting what he wanted through these unofficial channels. I mean, that's what you want in an intelligence officer, certainly. But my gosh, what guy was just incredibly effective.
Well, absolutely. If you can imagine running a presidential campaign, a winning presidential campaign at that, you are in the public spotlight 24/7. And Casey was doing that. And then with his left hand, with no one watching, he was secretly organizing a treasonous covert operation that took place all over the world. And it was just extraordinary realizing he had secret meetings in Madrid, in Paris, and it was amazing what he was pulling off.
Yeah, I recall that you had to work incredibly hard for such a long time to kind of nail down the details of this Paris meeting, which or series of meetings, I guess, which I want to talk about in a minute. But I'm curious. One thing that I've never fully understood really was these hostages were taken. And I understand it was chaotic and all that, but what ultimately was Iran looking for out of either the Carter administration or the Reagan campaign? What did they want for these hostages? What did they realistically expect to get for them?
Well, the hostages were actually taken by radicalized students, and
Hmm.
Khomeini the government did not officially seize the hostages.
Right,
They
right.
eventually took control over them, but it was not it was a really stupid strategic decision. And the reason for that was at the same time they were holding the hostages, Iraq was about to invade Iran. And this was the beginning of the Iran Iraq War. And up until the Islamic Revolution, the Shah had been America's great ally. I mean, this is part of the backstory that's really important is that the Shah had essentially been an American puppet, that we controlled the Shah, that he reported so directly to us, was so dependent on America. meant that we had easy access to enormous amounts of oil for an entire generation for the entire Western world. So Iran strategically was enormously important, and suddenly we had lost Iran, and Iran itself was becoming very vulnerable because Iraq was about to attack it. And we had this is something very few people saw. Their anti-American rhetoric was so loud that people forgot the geostrategic underpinnings, that the Western world relied on oil, on Iran for oil, and that in many ways Iran had been a close ally of Israel, and they didn't want to completely end that relationship and allow Iraq to take over, and especially at a time when Iran needed American weapons.
Okay, I see. So these were, correct me if I'm wrong here, these were weapons that the Shah's government had paid for or ordered or something like that. And now the new government that had overthrown his previous government, they wanted those because Iranian dollars had been spent to purchase these already. Is that more or less correct?
Exactly, precisely, and
Okay.
and it's also they had things like F-4 fighter jets, and suddenly they were running out of spare parts, spare tires, and so forth. And the U.S. had been providing military for both Iran and Israel had a lot of those spare parts, and Israel wanted Iran armed enough so that it could fight off Iraq. So they were saying that, gee, Carter has put on this embargo and it's going to leave Iran terribly vulnerable, which would potentially hurt Israel and the entire Western world if Iraq won. So they wanted weapons to go to Iran.
Hmm. Yeah, Craig, I have to go off on a slight tangent for just a moment. Reading your book at the end of September 2024 and learning that that Israel wanted to, ensure that Iran was well armed is just an astonishing statement, honestly, and it shows how much has changed since then, of course. But I was,
When you look at what's going on absolutely today with
yeah,
Iran attacking Israel with missiles.
right, totally amazing stuff. And I was kind of surprised. I mean, I know that they have a lot. Obviously, there's a lot going on in the Middle East at all times. That's the greatest generalization ever stated. But I thought that Israel would probably see Iran as, if not a current enemy, some sort of future adversary at the very least at that time. So I was kind of surprised with the level of enthusiasm for getting these weapons over there under any circumstances.
Remember, Saddam Hussein was running Iraq at the
Hmm.
time, and they
Right.
feared him more than Iran. And if Iraq has plenty of oil, and if it took over Iran's oil as well, suddenly you have a very, very powerful force there who was very antagonistic.
Yeah. Amazing how things can change. It really is. So all of this is something that they were trying to work through the Carter administration for, and Carter, I guess, was not having it. They were resisting, or things were going too slow, something like that, and that's where Bill Casey kind of saw an opportunity. Is that about right?
Yeah, Carter, I mean, one thing about this, and I should say this now, today is Jimmy Carter's 100th birthday. And
Yeah. That's incredible.
And I think he's been dismissed unfairly as a weak president who allowed America to be humiliated by Iran, when in fact, in many ways, he was undone by a treasonous covert operation by the Republicans. And that's one message I want to get across in all of this. And Carter really was against, I mean, perhaps one could argue perhaps he was too much of a Boy Scout and didn't want to send weapons to Iran. And that was probably the only way in which this crisis could have been resolved.
Hmm. Do you think that things were trending in that direction with the Carter administration at the time? Like, would this have been, peacefully resolved fairly soon, and kind of in the best interest of everyone had Casey not intervened?
I do think that would have been the case. And in fact, what you see towards later in the year, towards around September of 1980, within the Carter administration, it seemed like they were coming to realize, that Iran under the Shah had paid billions of dollars for weapons that had never been delivered. And they were willing to categorize those weapons as frozen assets since Iran had already paid for them, and to say that, okay, if you release the hostages, we will unfreeze these frozen assets. And there were communication discussions like that going on at the Carter administration. But William Casey's operation sort of took it out of their hands.
Okay, okay, yeah, I see. Really undercut the normal diplomatic channels there, and it is very unfortunate for Carter that you're right. He was, I mean, he left on sort of a low note there, and he's kind of remembered that way as a vaguely ineffective president, as far as I can see, anyway. And that's really unfortunate for him that he was kind of being undercut by other Americans at the time.
Right. And I mean, I every once in a while it takes me, I kind of want to look at the big picture, because Iran was being characterized as the most vile country in the world. There was so much venom from there directed at us, going both ways, towards them and from them. And the idea that Republicans, of all people, remember the Republicans were the muscular, militant hardliners when it came to the military, both in Vietnam, that was true in the Vietnam War, it was true during the Cold War, and it was true in the Middle East with regard to Iran. And the idea that they're making this treasonous deal with Ayatollah Khomeini was just sort of mind blowing.
Yeah, absolutely agree. Absolutely agree. My gosh. So I'm curious. We've been talking about what Bill Casey did, and he was Reagan's campaign manager. How much did George Bush and Reagan himself know about all of this at the time? Is that like an open question still, or do you think you have a pretty good answer as to what they knew and when they knew it, so to speak?
I don't have all the answers, but with Reagan, let me take them separately. With Reagan, Reagan famously said that when he talked to Bill Casey, Bill Casey's nickname was Mumbles, by the way, and when he testified before Congress, he would be asked a question and he'd say, "Oh, and you then
Oh man.
repeat the question, and he said, and so he was known as Mumbles. And Reagan said, I can't understand a word Bill Casey says. And you can ask someone to repeat themselves once, you can ask them twice, but you can't ask them a third time. It's rude. So whenever Casey's talking to me, I just smile and nod. And
Oh,
I think that says something about the way Reagan operated with Casey. He may have had the broad strokes, and he clearly knew something, but it's not clear exactly what he knew in terms of the details. George H.W. Bush, who was the vice presidential candidate and later vice president and president, was a different story, because as you'll remember, he had already been head of the CIA. And Bush, in his way, was sort of a master spy. There are mixed reports on whether he actually flew to Paris for some of these secret meetings with Iran. I remain agnostic in terms of whether he actually did that, but I think he must have been better informed on this than Reagan was, and he must have known some of the details.
okay. Yeah, that's certainly makes a lot of sense. And I also have to really hand it to Reagan for that answer that you just repeated, because it's incredibly charming and it honestly deflects with humor, his potential, like, I guess, culpability in all of this as well. Like, it makes you laugh, and a little bit of harmless poking fun at somebody else who's like the real spy master. And that's just incredibly suave, honestly, like a perfect answer to kind of redirect away from that question. It's amazing.
Precisely, and you end up not learning a damn thing, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So very interesting stuff. Now, if you don't mind, help me with the timeline. I know that George H.W. Bush was the head of the CIA. Was he leading the CIA when he was also campaigning for vice president, or did that come earlier? Before we go on, I want to tell you all about a new podcast from Tenderfoot TV called To Die For. Imagine you were a fly on the wall at a dinner between the Mafia, the CIA, and the KGB. That's where this unprecedented podcast begins. Brought to you by the makers of the hit podcast To Live and Die in LA, To Die For marks the first time a Russian trained honey trap has told her story from beginning to end. Taught to seduce men for their secrets and sometimes their lives, Alia Rosa was trained to believe that her body no longer belonged to her. it belonged to the state. She was meticulously trained to be the perfect weapon, able to seduce her targets into compromising situations that have ended careers and sometimes lives. From Tenderfoot TV, the studio that brought you Up and Vanished, and To Live and Die in LA. Make sure you check out To Die For, available beginning on March 26th, wherever you get your podcasts.
That came a bit earlier. He was before Carter's presidency. This campaign took place when Jimmy Carter was president, and Carter had installed his friend and classmate from the Naval Academy, Stansfield Turner, as head of the CIA. And Stansfield Turner was an enormously unpopular head of the CIA.
Oh, right.
And this is a complicating factor during this period because there had been a huge crackdown on the CIA. In post-war America, the CIA went wild, really. They executed coups d'etats all over the world, in Guatemala, in Syria, in Iran in 1953. And that's one of the things that was a precursor of the hostage crisis. The CIA had installed the Shah of Iran as its ruler, its puppet. The Shah did whatever we wanted, and suddenly he had been ousted, and the old guard of the CIA was very pissed off. It was as if we lost one of our major power bases in the Middle East. Our control of Iran had provided plentiful oil to the entire Western world for a generation or more, and now we lost it. And that was one of the reasons that you had many CIA operatives who were really angry at Jimmy Carter, and they wanted to help out Bill Casey, who was much more of a hardliner.
Okay, yeah, I can see how they would support that as well. Craig, I'm curious. I know that there was a series of meetings, of course, that took place to hash all of this out, but there was one specifically in Madrid that you spent a lot of time in the book kind of tracking down the details of. Can you talk about that one a little bit and whether or not Bill Casey actually made it there, and how he covered his tracks, that sort of thing?
There were meetings in late July 1980 in Madrid, and there were representatives from Khomeini's regime of Iran. Bill Casey was said to be there, and I believe I've proven that he absolutely was there, but this is a big point of contention. And this is where the negotiations really started to get going in terms of them setting the terms. This is where Bill Casey told Iran, look, we can get you weapons, even though we're not in the government now. But in return, we want you not to deliver the hostages. We want you to prolong their incarceration until after the election. If you release the hostages early, Jimmy Carter will get all the credit and he'll win the election. He'll be a great hero for it. There'll be this burst of patriotic fervor and he'll win the election over Reagan. Wait until after the election, and that way the Republicans could make fun of Carter for being weak and ineffective. And that's precisely, those were the terms that were outlined. And one of the real questions was Bill Casey there or not? If he was there, the October surprise took place. A deal was made because we know that the terms were implemented. We know when the hostages came out. And Casey however, had an alibi, and there was a conference in London during the same week that was a reunion for veterans of World War II who were in the intelligence world, who were veterans of the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, which was the precursor of the CIA. And Casey was a major figure in that world, and he appeared at that conference. But there were several days where it was a 5-day conference. I got the attendance sheets, and the question was Casey there the whole time, or could he have flown off to Madrid? Madrid is only an hour and a half from London by air. It's hard to explain this without the visuals, but they are printed. The actual attendance sheets are actually printed in my book, and you can see that Casey was penciled in as if he was expected to attend on key dates, but he was not inked in, which is what happened if you actually attended. And it took a while to actually prove that he was in Madrid, but I believe we ended up doing so in the book.
Yeah, that was very, very interesting stuff for me, honestly, Craig. And that was amazing that you were able to track down those attendance sheets from, decades before at that point, and that the crucial clue there is the difference between a pencil mark and a pen mark. Honestly, that's really amazing detail there, and I really loved it. So he attended. He was able to make some promises that are all predicated, of course, on Reagan winning the election. But I'm curious, how close was the election at that time? Like, was the hostage issue the key deciding factor for the voters at that time, do you believe?
Well, I think it really could have changed the outcome of the election. Of course, it's impossible to say that definitively. And in fact, there was high inflation, which was a very serious issue. And I don't want to minimize that. But in the last week or two, it really was neck and neck. And then when Carter didn't bring home the hostages, Reagan moved ahead and won rather convincingly. You can never say definitively that Carter would have won, but it was really the key. It was the key issue of the year and of the election.
Hmm. Yeah, I know it's a tremendous, tremendous emotional importance to the voters, and I know that once they were released, of course, that was enormous celebration happened, and even there was a stamp that was produced by the postal service for celebrating the return of the hostages. I have a handful of those. Actually, I got them, from a collector not too long ago. But if you're producing a stamp based on the release of these hostages, that really shows how significant it was to the, national American mindset at that time, I think.
Right, and there were ticker tape parades, and there
Hmm.
was yellow ribbons tied everywhere, and this is for your younger listeners won't notice have known this, but the newscast would sign off saying day 444 in captivity for the hostages. There was a countdown that went on forever, and it was more than a year. In the
Wow.
end, there were 444 days. So this was the TV news show ABC Nightline was started specifically to follow this story every single day. It was a daily news show on the ABC network, and this was the story they followed every single day.
Okay, did not. I was not aware that the countdown appeared every single night, but I can certainly see how that would really imprint in people's minds and keep it at the forefront of their national concerns. So, Craig, you mentioned the Israel connection earlier, and I believe there's this guy named Ari Ben Menashe who played a kind of a key pivotal role in all of this. Can you talk a little bit about him?
Sure, I spent so much time with Ben Menashe, and he was really one of the more mysterious characters. He was an Israeli agent and arms dealer, and he was one of the few people who would talk to the press. And he had he the way one way Israel was dealing with Iran was they would have intelligence operatives who would sell weapons to Iran, but it was to be done very, very secretly. And if they were ever caught, Israel was going to deny them. This is right out of Mission Impossible, of course.
Hmm.
Should you be caught, we will deny. Should you caught, we will deny knowing you whatsoever.
Sure, sure.
And that's what happened to Ari Ben Menashe. He was busted by U.S. Customs on an arms deal. He was in jail in the Metropolitan Correctional Center here in New York, which is where Jeffrey Epstein ended up dying. And when he got out of jail, he started talking to the press because Israel had sort of cut bait with him and he wanted to get back at them. And he started talking to reporters, including me, but Israel disowned him completely. And this put reporters like me in a very difficult position because you didn't know whether to believe Ben Menashe or not. Israel was saying he was crazy. And as I was investigating this, I talked earlier about how the press turned against the story. One way they turned against the story is they just said anyone who would talk to a crazy nut like Ben Menashe is a gullible conspiratorialist reporter.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was condemned with that label, as were other people who were trying to do serious investigations. And when I started interviewing him, he was in Australia. He was very much sort of on the lam and had gone to Sydney, Australia. And when I was at Newsweek, I would talk to him almost every day. And finally, Newsweek agreed to fly him to the United States so we could sit down with him for many hours at a time. I had literally dozens and dozens of hours of taped interviews with him. And he gave me all sorts of documents, which did show there was proof of arms dealing, that there was this secret channel Israel had of selling arms to Iran. And whatever you think of Ben Menashe, I think the documents prove that to be the case. And we've since learned that to be absolutely to be the case, regardless of what you may think of Ben Menashe. One of my big sources on this was Elliot Richardson, who, of course, he served in at least 4 cabinet positions in various Republican administrations. And Richardson is the kind of Republican who no longer exists. He was a model of probity. He was very much like a Boy Scout. But when I asked him what he thought of Ben Menashe, he said, look, if you're investigating whether it's intelligence or a crime, the fact of the matter is the people who know most about crimes are criminals, and the people who know most about intelligence are spies, and they're all liars, but they are knowledgeable. And what you should do is hear them out and corroborate or refute it. And that's what I did with Ben Menashe. And I was able to get enough information that I was 100% convinced there was a secret arms channel between Israel and Iran.
Okay. Yeah, you spent quite a bit of time with the guy. Were you able to validate a lot of what he was saying over the course of the years of your investigation in that case? I mean, I know you really struggled with his credibility, but it sounds like you ultimately, found a lot there.
Well, I certainly validated the fact that there were arms sales. There's no question of that to me. He went on and said that George Bush was in Paris. That I could not corroborate or refute. But the arms sales I could corroborate, and those definitely happened.
Okay, I see. And Craig, I'm curious in all of this, we're talking about incentives that are being offered to the Iranian government to release the hostages, but was there also any implied threat either from the Carter administration or from the Reagan campaign at that time? Like, if you don't release the hostages, here's what's going to happen. I haven't really heard anything about that other than, the Eagle Claw mission, and we all know how that ended, of course.
Right. Well, there were arms embargoes and economic sanctions, and those were the sticks. But the Carter administration was very, very wary of not wanting to turn this into a major war. So they were very, very reluctant to engage in any military exercises, even a rescue attempt, which they finally attempted in April of 1980, on April 24th, I believe it was.
Mm-hmm.
And in doing that, Carter was very reluctant. He did it at the last minute. He felt that he was out of all other options. But even that kind of operation was likely to result in some casualties, and he was very much aware of that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Sure. So, with all of this talk of what would happen after the hostages are released, was there any transfers of weapons parts or anything like that prior to that happening? Anything was happening before the actual inauguration of Reagan?
Yes, there were. I mean, it's a terrific question, and it's really what was remarkable because, I'm a private citizen. I assume you are as well,
Mm-hmm.
and just think about trying to get millions of dollars of weapons to a hostile foreign power that's been embargoed. I mean, I think it was, it seemed virtually impossible,
Mm-hmm.
but that's precisely what Bill Casey was able to pull off. And so you have these deliveries that went through Israel, and some of them actually took place, I believe it was on October 24th. And it was through Israel's alliance with the Republicans and Iran that it took place.
Wow. Okay. So I'm trying to work out, like, in my mind, the logistics of all of this, how a private citizen can get, weapons moving that have been embargoed. Like you said, were they already in Israel? Like, were they pre-positioned there and Casey just used his connections and his influence to make it happen?
Yes,
Or
a lot of
okay.
them most of them were in Israel. And for example, I mentioned the Hashemi brothers earlier. Well, The Hashemi brothers bought a cargo ship. I think they paid $3 million for it. And it would go from Israel to Iran. And when it reached Iran, it would change. It was repainted and its name was changed, and it would go back to Israel. And when it got back to Israel, it was repainted again and its name was changed and weapons were put on it. And it went back to Iran. And when it got to Iran, the weapons were unloaded. It was repainted yet again. Its name was changed. This happened a 3 round trip, 6 times of changing its name. And that's how some of the weapons got there.
Oh, man. Incredible. Very sneaky.
There was also a shipment that went from Israel to France. When the weapons got to Nîmes in southern France, the city of Nîmes, they were loaded onto what appeared to be an Iran Air commercial jet, but it wasn't really an Iran Air commercial jet. It was a cargo ship. And they flew over from southern France to Iran where the weapons were unloaded.
Wow. Okay. Were these all like a sort of like a down payment, I guess, before the election, just to prove that they were serious? You think? I mean, was this like a small fraction of what Iran would ultimately get?
Pretty much. I mean, I think it genuinely was for good, certainly for good faith, but it was also, these were necessary weapons. And sometimes I think they were simply tires for F-4 fighter jets. Some of the shipments included spare parts for C-130 cargo planes. That's what they were flying over.
Okay. Okay. I see. So, Craig, you mentioned earlier that you traveled to Iran to investigate this story. Can you talk a little bit about your movement there, and then who you met with, and what you learned while you were there? That was quite exciting to me for you to head right to the kind of the source of the whole story, really.
Right. It was a little frustrating because I don't speak Farsi, among other things. And I have to say, when you try to interview someone in what is essentially an adversarial context through a translator, it's a little difficult. But the key person I was trying to reach and that I did sit down with is a man named Mohsen Rafik Doust. If I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly. But he was head of arms procurement for Iran at the time. He had been friends of the Ayatollah Khomeini from the word go. And in 1979, I believe it was, Khomeini flew, who had been exiled and was in France, and flew to Tehran to lead the Islamic Revolution and take over. Mohsen Rafik Doust was there at his side, and they got in a car, and Rafik Doust was the chauffeur who drove them through the streets of Tehran with literally millions and millions of people cheering his arrival and the ouster of the Shah of Iran. And he then became head of arms procurement under the new Islamic government in Iran. So he knew everything that was going on. And I had heard a lot of reports of his role in the arms shipments. And when I interviewed him, I have to say he denied everything, but I don't necessarily believe him. But he played a key role in how the weapons got there.
Okay, I see. Yeah, that's incredible that you were able to travel there and meet the guy who was directly involved. And it's so unfortunate about that language block, because I totally get how they can hide a lot of stuff from the person between the interpreter and the source of the interview. And that must have been very frustrating. But ultimately, you proved to your satisfaction that all of this had definitely occurred, right?
Yes, there's no question to me that the Republicans got arms shipments to Iran, and to give you a sense of why I'm so sure of that, if you look in my book, I actually have the receipts and I published them. And one of the documents published in the book is an invoice. And if you read it carefully, the names include, these are weapons coming from Jamshid Hashemi, who I mentioned earlier. He was one of Bill Casey's an operative for the Republican Party. And the invoice is for parts for a C-130 cargo plane. I ended up getting the documents. These documents went to former president of Iran, Abul Hassan Bani Sadr, who gave them to me. He gave them to the congressional investigation. They're printed in the book.
Amazing stuff. You actually procured the receipts and you're able to print them up so everybody can kind of see for themselves exactly what happened. That's really incredible work. So You started this investigation in 1991, as you said, and you're publishing the book now, so many years later. What actually happened to all the people involved? And I mean, I think we all know about George H.W. Bush and Ronald Reagan, but what about Casey and Ben Menashe and all of the other figures? I mean, were they under any additional scrutiny at all in the years after this happened, or did they pretty much just get away with it completely clean, essentially?
Well, Casey died in 1986, just as the Iran-Contra investigations were coming towards their end, and that
Mm,
meant they were going right towards Bill Casey, who was head of the CIA. And in many ways, the whole Iran-Contra scandal, I think, was misunderstood, because the truth of the matter is the October surprise was the start of the Iran-Contra scandal. The Iran-Contra scandal was about secretly selling weapons to Iran. And as I've just explained, that began far earlier than
right,
1984.
right.
It began in 1980. And later they diverted, when Casey was head of the CIA, they diverted some of the profits from those arms sales to arm the right wing Contra rebels in Nicaragua.
Hmm.
Well, when that scandal played out in the United States, I think it was kind of murky. Most people didn't understand it. The media focused on Oliver North, if your listeners remember
Hmm.
him at all, who sort of turned himself into almost a matinee idol and became a political figure, a media star in some ways. But they didn't really get to the bottom of it. And the bottom of it, I think, was the October surprise.
Hmm.
That's where it really began. As for the others, I'm trying to think who else you want to talk about.
Ben Menashe, we mentioned.
Ben Menashe is still around, and I interviewed him again for this book 30 years after when I first reached out to him. He's in Montreal when I last spoke to him, and he's been involved in a lot of murky stuff ever since. He's sort of I'm trying to think who to compare him to, but he's the arms dealers are not the most savory bunch of people I've run into.
Yeah, I can imagine. He's staying true to character, at least, it sounds like.
Yeah.
I totally understand what you're saying about like the October surprise being kind of a prelude to Iran Contra, which many more people are familiar with, just generally speaking. But at the end of Iran Contra, what was it, like 13 people were convicted and sentenced to prison, I believe, but no one really suffered any negative consequences from October surprise. Is that correct?
Oh, that's completely true. I mean, it's well, except for the people who died mysteriously.
Yeah.
I mean, but no, but you're absolutely right in the legal sense. I mean, there was a congressional investigation. To me, it was an embarrassment. It was a whitewash. The Democrats let the Republicans get away with murder in it, and the key people were not investigated. I've been over the congressional investigation a dozen times, and in my book, I point out an enormous number of errors in it. I should also add a colleague of mine, Bob Perry, the late Bob Perry, was a terrific investigative journalist. He never let go of this story. And unlike me, he was based in Washington and was able to go to the bowels of Congress, to actually an abandoned ladies' room. And the congressional investigation had discarded a lot of its documents, and they left them in this abandoned ladies' room under a tampon dispenser.
Oh,
And
God.
Bob, who sadly died in 2018, collected just reams and reams of documents in cardboard boxes and brought them home. And Bob sadly died about 5 years ago, and his wife gave me access to his archives. And what I found extraordinary material in there. Among them, I found the receipts I mentioned earlier. That is the documents that showed Bill Casey's Republican operatives had secretly sold weapons to Iran. They were in
Hmm.
there. The receipts were there, and Congress threw them away and left them under the tampon
My
dispenser.
gosh.
No, even Bob had not gotten through all the documents, so this is the first time they've been published. I was also able, with the passage of time, I was also able to get people to talk who had never spoken before.
Hmm.
And one of them was a man named Robert Sensi, who was a Republican operative and a colleague of Bill Casey. And I first tried to reach him when I started on the story back in 1991, 33 years ago, and he wouldn't talk to me back then. But with the passage of time, he decided to talk. So I interviewed him and I asked him, I asked him just flat out, did the October surprise happen? And he said to me on the record, on tape, absolutely, 100 million% it happened. And then he started to tell me how he helped set up some of the meetings in Madrid between Bill Casey, excuse me, and the Iranians. And this shows you the kind of network Casey had, because since he was not a well known figure, he had been an executive for some of the airlines in the Middle East, I believe Royal Kuwait Airlines and one of the Emirati airlines. And in doing so, he was sort of a fixer who would arrange things for diplomats and set things up and get things done. And among the things, he could speak Farsi well enough to help set up meetings in Madrid for Bill Casey and so forth. So he told me how he traveled with Casey to these meetings, how Bill Casey wore a wig, he wore a blonde wig. He traveled under the name of Daniel O'Neill on a phony passport and all sorts of stuff like that.
Oh, man. That's fantastic that all of this stuff ultimately came to light. And I can't really get over the key to everything being in a box, a discarded box in a ladies' room for years and years and years until Bob finally discovered it again. But, how many other stories are waiting to be unlocked, and they're just out there in plain sight, so to speak. I guess we'll never know.
Yeah.
So, Craig, this has been really incredible, and I'm glad that all of your hard work has paid off and kind of borne fruit, and led to this book. I really encourage everyone to read it. You're just going to see things that have appeared over and over again here in the podcast and here in my other writings. The people that were involved in the October surprise and the event itself, it just ties into so much else that was going on during that period. And I was really glad for the opportunity to read this. If you want to pick it up for yourself, the book is available now. It's Den of Spies, Reagan, Carter, and the Secret History of the Treason That Stole the White House by Craig Unger. So, Craig, thank you so much for your time and all of your work in bringing this story to light. I definitely appreciate it.
Thank you very much. I appreciate your being on your show.
Absolutely. So now that this is published, are you setting your sights on another story in the future? Have you got a ninth book in the works at this moment, or are you doing something else entirely?
Not quite yet. I'm still, the book is just coming out today, actually, and I'm just promoting it. And I kind of want to get across, to me, part of the importance of this book and the story I tell is that it's very much a prequel of what we're going through now. That is, I think America doesn't like to embrace these stories. This is the dark side of America. This is the dark side of our history, and people try to forget it. But one of the oldest cliches in the books is that those who don't remember the past are condemned to repeat it. And I think we see that again and again and again, that our elections are often sabotaged. It happened in 1980, as I show in this book. It's happened, I think, repeatedly in 2016 with Trump, Russia. And today, again, we have an election coming up. And we see Donald Trump with very close relationships with Vladimir Putin, with Bibi Netanyahu, with MBS in Saudi Arabia. I think we should all be very wary that it may well happen again.
Yeah, you're totally right. History continues to repeat itself. And one thing that I find very unfortunate, at least for me as sort of like an amateur historian really, is how things don't really come to light until decades after they've happened. And sometimes we see things in the moment, but oftentimes like this, it's so long afterwards, long before anything can be effectively countered or responded to, that we find out what really went down. And that's really tragic, I believe.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much for your time, Craig. Do you have a website or social media profiles or anything you want to share in case
Yeah,
people want
my
to follow along with
website
you?
is simply my name, CraigUnger.com. I'm on Twitter, or rather X, and I would love to hear from readers.
Okay, fantastic. Yeah, we'll link those up in the show notes of this episode for the readers afterwards. So thanks again, Craig, and I look forward to whatever it comes next for you. Really appreciate the
Thank you
time.
very
Thank you.
much. Yep.
Take care.
Okay, bye.
If you're interested in more of Spycraft 101, look for my page on Instagram at Spycraft 101. You can also find more great articles on my website, spycraft101.com. Thank you all for listening, and I hope you'll stick around because there's lots more to come.
Disclaimer. This podcast is for entertainment purposes only. The stories and statements expressed herein are experiences and opinions. They may not reflect the views of the host or the production studio. It's okay if you disagree with our content. No piece of media is right for everyone. If you love Spycraft 101, please check us out online, on Instagram, on YouTube, and especially on Patreon. Thank you for listening.